Welcome to this video on the UFC, Dana White and boxing in general. So getting straight into it, Dana White obviously now involved with boxing, has been announced a while ago, and obviously still involved with the UFC as is sort of their figurehead of the UFC, but has been seen to be moving away from the UFC slightly, pushing his role slightly back and being more reserved and allowing other people in the UFC who are sort of the higher ups that, you saw Dana White before, you would always see Dana White. Well, maybe you don't see Dana White now, you see these other guys sort of showing that his priorities are across multiple things, not just the UFC now. Getting into it, so Dana White has been obviously working with Turki Al-Sheikh in boxing to, in the future as well, to bring across look, they're trying to make a UFC model in boxing with the money of Turki Al-Sheikh that he's got behind him, who's making all these super fights and trying to make basically, look, they're going to own a large majority, albeit, a big holder on the majority of the big fights in boxing. You look at UFC, you go, well, if I've got a load of money, I want to get into boxing, what do I want to make? I want to make a UFC again. Harder in boxing, but look, difficulty in business and in sport pretty much always gets resolved with a load of money, which they have. That's key. They're making the super fights. And again, boxing, has that been improved by the amount of money going into it and making these fights that no one else could make? Of course. And do I think that's a threat to the boxing promoters that are currently there? Yes, of course. That is a big thing. There's sort of a, let's get into boxing, let's show my name, this is what I do. I'm paying these guys top whack, even though the top guys, Fury, things like that, to get the fights on. And then you start going, actually, I want to start taking it. I want to take the young prospects. I want to start making my own promotion. I want to start doing everything I can to take over the sport and not just pay promoters or pay fighters outside my promotion a load of money. I want to make my own. I want to own the thing that I'm putting so much money into that sort of has a gap in the market where many fans were coming across and going, well, I'm going to UFC because there isn't the correct fights being made in boxing. But going back on the other side, a load of fans previously, including myself, went over to UFC when boxing wasn't creating the fights that should have been made. And now the UFC, I think them UFC fans are starting to go back towards boxing and have been over the last couple of years, and especially now. And I think this is the point I'm going to get into in the video. Dana White's when it started working across boxing as well, which is a key thing. I don't know if it's a key thing for the UFC business. How key has he been in the background matchmaking and things like that? But one question I want to ask you is, who do you think is the biggest fighter in the UFC right now who will bring in, so probably if you're watching this video, you're not a casual fan, but who brings in the casuals? Who's the Conor McGregor? Who's, he's won a million, but who is that top tier fighter that you go, I want to watch no matter what? I'm going to bring in people that have not watched the UFC fight in a long time or ever. Actually, this fight means I want to watch it no matter even if I've watched the UFC fight before. There's so much hype around it, I've got to see it. And look, the top people in the UFC currently who I think bring in fans and bring in people are, for me, Kayla Harris in the female division, looking for a title shot, great fighter. But I think, look, that's not a champion. Kayla Harris isn't a champion yet, and she could fall. And also, who is she? She's fought some good fighters, but who she really fought with a massive name? No one. No one massively who's a superstar in their own right. Tom Aspinall, great fighter. He's beat Sergey Pavlovich. But who else? He's waiting for a John Jones fight, which he hasn't got and may never get. Where's that? Who wants us? And he may never fight. He's been on the sidelines for ages, so you can't say Tom Aspinall is. not through his own fault, granted. Topuria, obviously, great wins against Volk and Holloway in the past. But again, probably going up in division to lightweight. And who does he face there? He could tumble. But he isn't currently a superstar. He has potential to be. Makhachev, same thing. Great at lightweight, but, he's fought some big names. But have they actually been a superstar in their own right outside of the UFC? Really, that's the key thing. Have they been the superstar outside the UFC? Oliveira, I would say no. Gaethje, outside the UFC, no. Poirier, maybe because of Conor McGregor fights, but I would say, yeah, maybe, okay, but no, I'd say. And he's coming to an end of his career. Does he bring in the massive amount of casual names? I would say not. Alex Pereira, great fighter, does quite good for pay-per-views and probably brings in a lot of casual fans after, beating Adesanya and the resume he's got, but he's just lost. So a big one where, look, that's a bit of a tough one. And also, doesn't have that big part of it where the press conferences, bringing in fans by, really just talking like McGregor did. And there's been no replacement for that, and there's not really been a big change in who is that next guy. Chimaev, great fighter, and again brings in more names than the above currently, except from Tom Aspinall if he gets John Jones fight. But Chimaev, has he really got that star power? Has he really got that star in him? He has if he wins his next fight, but currently no. And Shevchenko's doing incredibly well, but has done well enough, but isn't the UFC superstar we all thought. Sean O'Malley lost and looked terrible in his last fight, and sort of was the next guy who the UFC thought would be a superstar. So he's got a tough road back and sort of been out for a long time. And I do think, even though we're talking about some of these champions, Topuria, Chimaev, look, who brings in more casual fans than Paddy Pimblett? And that is a key thing. Who brings in through press conferences normally, or just talks with media? Who is bringing in more fans than Paddy Pimblett? I think that is the key thing. That is the big problem. And I think that's a problem for the UFC. I think there's just such a gap in getting them fans away from another sport like they were doing. When McGregor was in his prime, they were bringing fans over from boxing because they weren't making the big fights and you had a massive name in the UFC. And now you haven't got that and you're not making big fights like Tom Aspinall, John Jones, Topuria versus Makhachev. You're allowing people to move, not giving them money to allow a super fight to happen. And you got future superstars losing. Sean O'Malley being the main example. And I think that's the key problem with the UFC. I think Dana White is moving towards boxing. There is a shift in the pattern of the background of the UFC, the backstage people behind the UFC, the top people making these fights, and I don't think they have these superstars incoming to the UFC, which means that the boxing world is going to sort of lap up fans and take fans away from the UFC. It's going to completely switch, and it's all down to one person, Turki Al-Sheikh, and Dana White's working with him. That's the crazy thing, is that Dana White is not focused on the UFC, where you've got a lack of champions, a lack of pay-per-view stars, and look, how many fight nights have you wanted to watch recently? How many UFC events, the numbered events, have you want to watch recently other than the main event? Lacking, even Alex Pereira losing. Did you want to watch the Alex Pereira last fight? It's not that huge fight that you wanted to see. It's not the huge, massive names that you want to see. Alex Pereira, John Jones, things like that. You every so often you need that type of fight. Makhachev to Topuria, and it's just not happening. It's just not forthcoming by the UFC, and they just seem to be going, oh yeah, Makhachev, you move up, Topuria, you move up, and just separate yourselves. And it becomes a problem where we're not getting this. I mean, I'm not saying, spoil really, but come on, there's got to be a big fight where there's some upcoming guy, and Chimaev is one of them, granted, but there's got to be that huge fight once a year of two superstars fighting each other to keep up with what boxing is doing now. Because you've got a real competitor now. Yes, previously you may not have been doing so, and look, you still have the vast majority of fans coming towards you. You weren't losing that many fans to boxing because they weren't making the fights. Now they are. You've got to make the fights as well, which is key. And that is a key problem with the UFC at current. They are not making the big fights that to compete with their main competitor, which is boxing. Yeah, MMA, you've got the majority shareholding or share value of MMA. You are the main company putting on MMA events. And boxing, you got Turki Al-Sheikh just pulling out the bag of these super fights. He's announcing Canelo Crawford, which Dana White was promoting or working with the teams to get that sorted. And it's just a bit of you're working with the people you were trying to take fans off. And it's sort of the point of, is your focus towards boxing now, away from the UFC? Or is that going to change? And I think it's not. I think Dana White's looking to get out of the UFC in some way. He's trying to get into boxing, into the bigger fights where he probably has less control of it, and he's just a part of the overall in boxing. It's probably sort of like a contracted person to go, look, we want your advice, we want you to help us in decisions, but overall you're not in full control and looking towards taking a less responsible, important role within what he is doing. And that will come at some point, even in the UFC, where Dana White doesn't want to be the main man, and he has to think about, look, what do I want to do in my personal life in future? I think it's a bad time for UFC for it to be happening, where Dana White seems to be taking a step back, where there's no superstar. I think that's the key thing. I think if there was a superstar out there, Dana White started pulling himself back. The big pay-per-views were still happening. The top money, response of, sort of a Conor McGregor type style person was in there making the pay-per-view records that you all want to see. I think it would be easier. I think it would be a lot easier. If Paddy Pimblett was champion, I think you find it's a lot better. But, if the Tom Aspinall, John Jones fight was happening, type thing. If these super fights were happening that we seem to be getting around to that aren't happening, then I think, no one really minds. I wouldn't making a video, but I think with Dana White stepping sort of slightly down, sort of away, partially from the UFC towards boxing, allowing other people to take charge and from the background to come forward into the public view. I think it's just come at a bad time for the UFC. I think the UFC has declined slightly, at least, and has caused a problem. I think you need a Chimaev, you need a Topuria Makhachev fight, you need Tom Aspinall, John Jones fight right now to make the fans come back and realise that boxing isn't the only one putting on these massive super fights at the minute. Canelo Crawford got announced. You need to announce your own super fight in UFC. Please let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.